coming up.
I did think to myself, this wouldn't be happening if I was a man. Some of the disrespect that I received from the press gallery, even from business leaders. Do you think that a man who stays home to look after his children is less of a man? Oh, absolutely. I was personally very close to Hillary Clinton. On the prospects for a woman leading Australia, of course, I'm a big supporter of...
I'm Adil Cader, and this is Talking Foreign Affairs, where we bring you unfiltered conversations with global changemakers. We all remember where we were when this iconic viral speech was made.
I will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny by this man. I will not.
Now, hear what they never told you. Today, I sit down with Australia's first and only female Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, in an exclusive conversation revealing the stories that never made the headlines. From the hidden sexism she faced in office to the global retreat on diversity. She reveals what's really happening behind the scenes and why Gen Z's views on gender might be heading in the wrong direction. Stick around, this might just change how you see leadership, power, and equality on the world stage. Welcome to the program, the Honourable Julia Gillard.
It's great to be with you. Thank you for having me.
So Julia, let's start off with your historic speech back in October 2012. At the time, did you have any idea that it would go on to be so iconic?
No, I most certainly did not. And it was a sliding doors moment in the sense that in many ways it was just another parliamentary day. I was getting ready for question time. In the Australian Parliament, you have a session each day called question time where the opposition can ask the government and most particularly the Prime Minister any question they want to without notice. And because of the events in the media that day, I thought question time would be about sexism and accusations against me and the government on sexism. So I was getting ready for that. But as it turned out, when I walked into the Parliament, the opposition decided to immediately bring on a debate. So I didn't know I was going to be giving a speech until I was giving it. And I certainly had no sense when I was giving it that it would be something that we would be talking about many years later.
If you could go back in time and change anything about that speech, would you?
Obviously, you can't go back in time, but even if I could, I couldn't change anything because it was a speech given in a moment. It wasn't written, it wasn't prepared. It just came to me as I was giving it, and I don't think it would have had the immediacy or the authenticity if it had been delivered in any other way. So, no, it's not the kind of speech that you look back on and think, if only I'd written it differently or written it better. It was a speech just given instantaneously, and so it had to be what it was.
12 years on, that speech is still going viral. We're seeing Gen Zers with it on platforms like TikTok doing dances. Why do you think it continues to strike such a chord with younger audiences?
I think in many ways the speech has got a life of its own well beyond that day in the Australian Parliament, in some senses even well beyond me. And I think it continues to resonate because women and girls still know that they go out into a world which is not equal. And there are many times when they're getting ready to go out into that world, perhaps they're expecting a hard conversation or a difficult moment during the day. And I think the speech has become a bit of a battle anthem. People listen to it. Women and girls listen to it to help them get ready to confront what lies in front of them. And I'm proud that it's playing that role for people.
You know, one thing that really stood out for me in my memory of that speech was the international reaction. I remember Secretary of State Hillary Clinton reaching out and commending you on your performance in that speech. You've worked closely with leaders like Hillary Clinton, but also other prominent female leaders during your time in office, but also during your current position as the head of Jewel. Can you just share any moments or experiences where you sought each other out for advice or offered support through challenges?
Oh, absolutely. I was personally very close to Hillary Clinton, to Secretary Clinton, as she then was, and I continue to be close to her today, and she was a great source of advice for me. She certainly stayed across what was happening in Australian politics. She'd had her own experiences with the intersection of gender and politics. So when we met together, we did talk about these issues. And I remember going to international meetings like the G20, where other women would be present, Chancellor Angela Merkel from Germany, for example. And in the sidelines of those meetings, the women would often talk about the things that were happening to them. So it is nice that there's that sense of commonality and exchange, because when you're in that position of leading your nation, in that moment, there is really no one who can quite understand what you're going through. And so the people who can best help you and best advise you are people who are going through comparable experiences in other nations.
I want to go back to your university days back in the early 80s. If we look at the 80s and female leadership, one politician in particular stands out, Margaret Thatcher. I'm very keen to know your reflections on her as a head of state, even though politically you are on opposite sides of the spectrum. And were there any other female leaders that you had looking up to?
Yeah, I think the leadership of Prime Minister Thatcher just proved to me that a woman could do these jobs. There was no role model in Australia when I was growing up, no woman who led Australia, no woman at that stage who led a state of Australia in the position of Premier. And so, there were just no role models. So when Prime Minister Thatcher was elected, at least the penny dropped in my mind that it was possible for women to end up elected as nations' leaders. Now, of course, I didn't share her political views. And in my family, we certainly didn't share her political views. My father came from a coal mining village in South Wales, and his brothers and sisters were still in that village, still involved in coal mining. And you would remember that one of the big hallmarks of the leadership of Prime Minister Thatcher was the coal miners' strike and all of the difficulties and hardships that brought to coal mining communities, including the one where my father was. So we were not in admiration of her policies, but as a young woman, it did bring home to me that politics was a pathway for women.
Just touching upon your book, I really like the chapter by Alida Borges, which explored the importance of women's leadership from diverse angles. You have also worked with a diverse range of leaders from different countries. One name in particular stands out, Dr. Nkonjo-Iweala. I also really admire the work that your institute does in promoting leadership from different angles, understanding that whether it's the global north or global south, that depending on the region, female leadership is viewed differently. I'm keen to know what qualities you've learned from leaders like Dr. Nkonjo-Iweala, and particularly among other leaders in the global south.
Yes, I have had the opportunity of working with Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who now, of course, is the Director General of the World Trade Organization, and of the jobs in today's world that are really, really hard to do, that would have to be up there as one of the hardest. So I'm a huge admirer of hers. It's a great privilege too to work at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership with the young researchers like Alida, who are doing so much work on intersectionality, the touching points between gender inequality and racism. I think that, we can learn from each other right around the world. I don't think about it in my mind as global north and global south. Maybe that's an Australian thing because we are in the south. But I just think about the globe with all of its diversity, and I look at all of the nations on earth, and we know that whilst some have made more progress on gender equality than others, there is no society which is truly gender equal. So I think we've all got things to learn from each other's perspectives.
That is quite interesting. I'm also quite keen to know from the research you have done, are there any countries, models you looked at and gone, wow, from a gender equality perspective, that really makes sense? Maybe that's something we can try here in Australia.
Yes, we do look a fair bit at the Global Institute at the cold northern countries and Norway, the Scandinavian nations, because when you look at the World Economic Forum's index each year of the countries that have made the most progress towards gender equality, countries like Finland and Iceland and Norway are always very much to the fore. And so, of the policies we've looked at, we've certainly looked at the work and family life policies in countries like Norway, and the fact that they have a policy suite, which means in a male female couple, both partners have their own entitlement to paid parental leave. If you don't take it, then you lose it. You can't move it from one partner to another. And so in Norway, the practice has been, once this entitlement came into effect, for women to use their paid entitlement at the time of the birth of the baby and when the baby is smallest, and then for men to use their paid entitlement a little bit later when the baby is bigger. And because men are involved with that intensity of care when the baby is very young, that shows in better patterns of shared care even 5 years later when the child is of school age. So I think there's a lot to learn from nations like Norway about how we best support working families, and we best support working families in a way which enables every participant in the family to be a carer.
That is quite true. A lot of people do look up to the Nordic countries and their model of gender equality. In your book as well, you've talked about the importance of global recognition. When I've asked former female leaders about their role models on my show, a lot of them do mention figures like Thatcher, but tend to overlook other female heads of state who came before or served during the same time, especially those from underrepresented countries or countries like we use the term global south, who there isn't that much discussion about them in the media. What do you think can be done to better recognize those women and their contributions?
Yeah, I'm confident that we know more than we used to about countries around the world. I think all of our new communications mechanisms, they've certainly got some downsides, but it is far easier to get global news than it used to be when you were just relying on a few foreign affairs pages in your local newspapers to try and learn about what was going on around the world. And in a place like Australia, when I was growing up, they had a big bias to reporting, UK news and US news and perhaps news from some other parts of the Commonwealth, but not news from everywhere. So I think it's easier than it used to be. And I think there are a number of organisations like the Women Political Leaders Forum, which help us learn about what women are doing. So I think that we can get the information these days, but it always does pay to shine a spotlight on women who are achieving, because I think women around the world are not just looking for role models, but they're looking for role models who are most like them. And so the more women we can spotlight, the more likely it is that a girl or a young woman is going to look and to see a role model who particularly appeals to her.
Speaking about the US, there is no doubt that they do play a major role when it comes to setting trends. Do you have a bit of concern, like we saw in 2016 with the rise of populism globally, that this trend of anti-DEI might be trending globally as well?
Look, I'm very concerned about the ripple effects from the new policies of the Trump administration. And I think we have to remember that whilst these are the policies that have got the biggest impact in the world, the Trump administration is not the first to take action against diversity, equity and inclusion. Other leaderships, I'm thinking here of countries like Hungary with Orban, they have already taken very profound measures against diversity, equity and inclusion. But the ripple effects from the US are large. Clearly, it matters to the US, but because the US government is using its purchasing power even beyond the shores of the US, where the US government procures things, I know that it is saying to companies and organisations, we will no longer buy things from you, even though you're active well beyond the shores of the US. We will not buy things from you if you continue to have a diversity, equity and inclusion policy. And then, of course, because some of the biggest companies in the world are US companies, when they shift gears and move away from DEI, we've seen a number of them not just do that for their US operations, but do that for their operations globally. And I also fear that there are businesses who aren't really touched by the ripple effects of the US in a direct sense. It's not a purchasing power issue. It's not the US government directly relating to them, but they look at this happening in the world and say to themselves, well, maybe this would be a good time to no longer pursue these policies and we can just quietly drop them. So at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, we are trying to track and trace this to work out just how bad those ripple effects are, to work out who is moving away from their diversity, equity and inclusion policies, because the world should have that data. We should know that as consumers, as people who buy from businesses. We're entitled to that information, in my view. And I think we've also got to double down on explaining that, properly done, diversity, equity and inclusion policies are impactful, they make change and they make positive change for everyone. I mean, we've just talked about a Norwegian policy, admittedly a government-led policy, but a Norwegian policy which is unambiguously good for everyone. It's good for men, it's good for women. And so if we can properly explain all of that, I hope that we can build up a constituency much larger than it is now, which is very pro-DEI and prepared to demand it from employers and organisations.
I know, right? And especially with this changing constituency, which we're seeing globally, it's a very fascinating moment, at least here in Australia, where Gen Z and millennials are becoming the majority of the voters. On the surface, you'd expect that younger generations to be more supportive of DEI and gender equality, but a recent report by your institute, Jewel, shows that Gen Z men and women are actually the most divided on the issue, something I found quite shocking. Why do you think that is, and what can we do to address this?
Yes, we have been putting out these reports for a number of years now, and I would really urge people to get on the Global Institute for Women's Leadership website and have a look at this material themselves. It's global polling research by the very noted polling company Ipsos Mori. The most recent one, which we released in March this year alongside International Women's Day, is a poll in around 30 countries. And you can divide the answers by gender and by age. And when we do that, we see, for example, that in answers to questions like, do you think that a man who stays home to look after his children is less of a man? Actually, more young men will say yes to that than men over 60, which is the reverse of what you would expect. Most people would expect that younger generations are more progressive on gender equality questions, older generations less progressive. We're not the only organisation doing this kind of research work. I think we were one of the first to the field. And we are hoping to marshal some resources to do a deep dive into why this is happening. No one has all of the evidence yet about why. But we think a few things are probably going on. Number one, we do know that there are young men who are quite alienated. They feel like their lives are quite hard. They're finding it hard to get economic opportunities, hard to get educational opportunities. A significant percentage of them are both out of work and out of school. And so there's some real disadvantage there to be addressed. I think this is a generation of young men who went to school when there were programs for the girls, which had been brought in because at that point girls were being left behind in school, but perhaps the boys looked at those programs and thought it was unfair that those programs were there and they didn't have access to them. We also don't quite know what is the impact of the online environment. Obviously, this is much discussed, the sort of misogynist influences online, the nature of violent pornography online, but you would intuitively think all of these things are having an effect.
Yes, and speaking on generational change, the chapter in your book that highlights young activists like Chanel, Caitlin, and Sally, what's one insight from your conversation with them that really stayed with you? Maybe something when you listened to it, you went, geez, I wish this is something I had known back when I was in office.
Yeah, the chapter in the book where I get to talk to young women was an important chapter for me. I did learn from the conversations, and I think of the things I learned, it's how these young women activists are, so very clear in their views about gender equality, about the pathways for their own lives, and about what they want the changes to be. I think that they have a sharpness of vision that I didn't have on gender equality when I was their age. And they've got a savvy about how to campaign on it, and particularly how to campaign in the online world that we live in. So how to campaign nationally and globally, which I definitely learned from. And the fact that, for example, Chanel's campaign, the Teachers' Consent campaign, has had such success, I think is down to that kind of campaign savvy.
With generational change, as you mentioned, comes great hope. Do you believe the US will see a female president in the near future?
I would hope so, and I would think so, but it's hard to see timing and opportunity from where we are here. I think gender played a very big role in the 2016 campaign when President Trump was first elected. I think it played a very big role in how Hillary Clinton was perceived in that campaign. I think one of the things that happened out of that campaign is people got more analytical about the role of gender and gender stereotyping. And Vice President Harris, when she campaigned to be president, was therefore informed by that research. And I think you could see that in her campaign. But I think her loss, the re-election of President Trump, does mean that there's some further reflection to do. And I think it might be quite a while before we see a female candidate come to the fore in the US. But we don't know from here exactly who will shape up for the next election. So potentially too early to judge.
Moving from an American female head of state to an Australian female head of state, I know you've been asked this question many times on when do you think Australia will see another female prime minister, to which you all tend to answer that you do think it's possible, but you'd like to see the Albanese government be in power for quite a number of years. So let me reframe that question to make it a bit more unique and something a bit more insightful to our listeners. Growing up, who is one Australian female politician you admired and someone you had wished went on to become Prime Minister?
Well, I certainly very much admired Joan Kirner, who was the first woman to lead the state of Victoria. I got to know her when I was a young woman because her son, Dave Kirner, was involved in student politics at the same time that I was involved in student politics. So I had the opportunity to know Joan as she continued to rise in politics and ultimately became Premier. I think she would have made a formidable contribution in federal politics as well if she'd had an opportunity to go into it. And I certainly did rely on her mentoring and advice in my own political career.
Julia, we covered quite a bit in this interview already. I'd just like you to reflect back in your time in office. And can you just share a moment where you thought to yourself, if I were a man, this wouldn't be happening?
There were certainly days when I thought to myself, this wouldn't be happening. Even the first full day I was Prime Minister, when all of the media reporting was about what I was wearing rather than what I was saying or promising to do, I did think to myself, this wouldn't be happening if I was a man. Some of the disrespect that I received from the press gallery, from the opposition, even from business leaders, I did think to myself, this wouldn't be happening if I was a man. So there were many days. I can't say to you I had the magic formula for addressing all of those. I didn't then. I actually probably know more about the steps that you can take now, having had the opportunity to research and to reflect and to work with great thinkers at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. So I think there are some strategies that women can employ and have friends and supporters shine a light on the gendered treatment and get people to think it through and address it. But we aren't in a circumstance yet where, 100% every day we can say that women in Australian politics or women in other parts of the world in politics are being treated equally. On the prospects for a woman leading Australia, of course, I'm a big supporter of Prime Minister Albanese and his government, but it's never the story of the one woman. In order to be in a circumstance where women can come through for leadership, you need to have political parties that have ensured that women are well represented in their parliamentary number, which is why I'm absolutely delighted that the Albanese government is actually more than 50% women. And that does mean that there are women in the ranks now, and I would say women in generations to come, who will have the opportunities, learn from being cabinet ministers, get the skills. So if a leadership option becomes available at some point in the future, they're ready to go. And I think if we look at the conservative side of politics, we're not seeing the same. We're seeing women still less than 30%. And if you don't have a starting class that is sort of 50% women, then it is less and less likely that you are going to have a woman leader at any point in the future.
Just on a light note to end this interview, one of my listeners was quite keen that I ask this question to you. Before heading into question time, did you have a routine or a go-to song that you'd listen to get into the zone?
There wasn't a go-to song. I actually used to try and spend the last few minutes before walking to the Parliament by myself, and as much as anything else, it was just about feeling your adrenaline kick in, regulating your breathing, and just getting yourself into a quiet and focused state of mind and ready to go.
On that note, Julia, thank you so much for your time and sharing your insight with us on Talking Foreign Affairs. It's been a real privilege having you.
Thank you very much. That's kind of you. Thank you for the opportunity.
That was former Prime Minister Julia Gillard, sharing powerful reflections on gender equality and international leadership. If you enjoyed this episode, hit follow and leave us a rating. There's so much more waiting for you, including exclusive content, full-length interviews, and opportunities to connect with your favorite celebrity advocates and global leaders. Join the conversation on Instagram, YouTube, LinkedIn, and TikTok. Just search Talking Foreign Affairs. Until next time, from me, Adil Cader, thanks for tuning in, and keep engaging with the world around you.